understand that you are here for the 20th Annual Disaster Awareness Day. I'm John Gregg. I'm a member of the Council of the Town of Seabrook Island. One of my functions on Town Council is Public Safety Official, which is why I'm standing here at this podium. I'm going to be functioning as your Master of Ceremonies stroke hammer, and I will call up first Craig Weaver, Mayor of the Town of Kiawah Island.
I noticed I didn't shout it quite with the same gusto that we heard here. Hey, we're going to try to do something just slightly different here this morning in the first few minutes of this program, because obviously something's a little different this year than it has been the last several years, which is we had a hurricane a few months ago. And so we obviously, from the standpoint of the towns, Kiawah and Seabrook, who have a responsibility to try to manage and plan for and help our communities through these storms, we had an opportunity to put into action all of the things that we've spent a few years thinking about and studying for and planning for. And we spent a lot of time since Matthew sort of thinking back, what did we learn, what did we experience, what could be improved. So what Ron and I thought we would do just to start this session off today, and maybe it'll be a good segue into a couple of the panel discussions, is to just take a couple minutes to talk about what we saw as some of the key learnings or some of the key issues that we got from having experienced Matthew. I'll take a couple minutes, Ron will take a couple minutes, just at a very high level. And then what we want to do is take a few minutes and we'll actually open it up to questions. We thought we might benefit from hearing what some of you all experienced or thought about how things went in October, or areas that you might like to hear some more discussion about. I'm always curious, let me ask two questions real quick, just so I know the audience. How many people are here from Kiawah? A bunch, more than and how many from Seabrook? Okay, Ron, you still own the place. I'm also curious, how many of you were here during the 1989, during Hurricane Hugo? Not very many. And you know, the fact that there are so few hands that went up really highlights two of the challenges that our two communities have in trying to prepare for a major tropical storm. First, all of us really have very little experience with a hurricane. We spend a lot of time, our staffs, our communities, our residents have spent a lot of time in the past years planning for, thinking about, and talking about hurricanes, but we really haven't experienced a hurricane, particularly a serious hurricane, in 28 years. So to a large extent, we are trying to plan for and deal with something that we actually have never gone through. And it's a serious challenge. Additionally, the staffs that we rely on, whether it's the town staff, the community staff, they have not been through a hurricane either. So clearly we have a challenge because we're trying to do our best to plan for something that we've actually never experienced. Second, I think it's important to remember that both Kiawah and Seabrook are totally different communities than they were in 1989. I have sat since I've been involved with this side of the town's activity in a lot of meetings where people say, well, back in 1989 when Hugo came, well, we did this, or this worked, or that happened. And that's useful, but we need to remember that we are so different today. We're considerably larger. We've got a lot more developed property. We have more roads. We have more houses. We have more residents. We have more absent property owners, which when I'll talk about communication later is a real issue for us. And we've got a whole lot more tourists. So even trying to extrapolate the experiences that we had in 1989 are very difficult for us today. Now, we did just experience a hurricane last October, but similarly, I would argue that it's very hard to extrapolate from Hurricane Matthew to what the next storm is going to be like, because very small differences in a storm can generate a very different effect. I would argue that we did experience the perfect storm because Matthew stayed sufficiently offshore. It moved pretty quickly. It had a little storm surge, and it hit at low tide. We were clearly inconvenienced as a community, but we were not seriously hurt as a community. Yet that storm probably cost, in the case of Kiawah, and I don't know for Seabrook, but in the case of Kiawah, even that moderate level 2 storm that stayed offshore cost the town and the community association, just for debris cleanup, probably $1.25 million for that storm. Yet, if you just go down the coast a little bit, the same storm, same level, hitting Hilton Head a few hours earlier. It was moving a little bit slower, moving a little bit closer to Hilton Head. It was at high tide. Based on the discussions we've had with them, cost them $80 million to clean up. And those are the costs that they're telling us for a combination of the town, their community associations, and their regimes. So $1 million for Kiawah, $80 million for Hilton Head. Now, you may say Hilton Head's a lot bigger island than Kiawah or Seabrook, but even if you extrapolate back on size, that same storm hitting us a few hours earlier could well have generated a $12 to $15 million impact on us. So when you look at hurricanes, it's really tough to know what it is that you're going to deal with. I do think that both Kiawah and Seabrook's town and community associations handled Matthew well. Clearly, there are things we could have done better. There are things we're going to do better next time. But we have spent a lot of time trying to look back and say what can we learn from and what do we need to address. And so, Ron and I are both going to talk about 3 or 4 things. I'll be really fast on the case of Kiawah. There are 4 things that I think we learned and have to deal with. The first one is communication. We communicated everything constantly. Stephanie Braswell Edgerton, who I don't think she's in here right now, and she's the person on our staff who actually coordinated most of this meeting. She's the person behind all of our communications during the storm. And what we learned is it is a huge challenge. In the case of Kiawah, and I think you're probably very similar on Seabrook, we have an exceptionally diverse population scattered all over the country. And they have different communication needs. They differ in what they want to know. And they differ in what they think is important. And they differ in how they want to learn about it. And so the challenge for us is how do you create communications that are going to meet the needs for all of these different populations? And if you think about it, our residents, what they're concerned about is, do I have to evacuate? When do I have to evacuate? Where will I go? When can I get back in? Somebody who's sitting up in New Jersey who owns a very expensive home on Kiawah has a totally different set of things they're concerned about. So trying to create communications that are relevant and meaningful to all of our very diverse populations is an amazing challenge for us, and one that we thought we did well, but we absolutely know that we have to do better. The other communications challenge that we have to deal with deals with the advent of social media. So social media is a real issue for us because if you think about the town's responsibility, we have a responsibility to make sure that what we are communicating is absolutely accurate, factual, that people can depend on what the town tells them is actually what is happening on the ground or what they should do. And that means we got to be a little more conservative, a little more deliberate. We need to take a little bit more time. But we got social media out there today. We've got Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And my assessment from the hurricane is that for social media, speed trumps accuracy. And so, what you have is another whole forum out there of people and individuals who are communicating a lot of information. And some of it is very helpful, some of it is very accurate, but a lot of it is not. And so the town's caught in this situation between how do we be relevant to our constituents, how do we make sure that people are looking to the town and saying, I'm getting the information that we need, but at the same time, they're being barraged with all different kinds of information from all different kinds of sources that may or may not be accurate. So communications is something that from Kiawah's standpoint, we think we did well, but we're going to continue to work on. The second one is resource limitations to the town. And I know that Ron is going to talk about that, so I'm going to slide by that one because I know he is going to handle it better than I will, but everything he says about this issue relates to Kiawah as well. The third is security. How do we satisfactorily secure our island both during a storm and especially if we ever have to keep the island evacuated for an extended period of time? This is a challenge, especially since we don't have a dedicated police force. Now, I want to be very clear in the case of Kiawah, I am absolutely comfortable that during Matthew, we had outstanding responsive support from our Charleston County deputies, both those that, both the county-wide deputies overall, as well as the deputies that work for are assigned to Kiawah. So I'm comfortable that in the storm we had our arms around the security issues. But having said that, and I know there's going to be a panel discussion, I think right after this one, about evacuation and security, and Tony Elder from the Community Association at Kiawah is on it. We've had many conversations, and we have a real issue, and the issue certainly is if we had to keep Kiawah evacuated and closed for an extended period of time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, what would we have done? How would we have handled that? Frankly, I don't know, but it's an answer that we've got to get. Our residents have put a very high bar in front of us on what they expect the town and the community association to be able to do in ensuring that their properties and their homes and their commercial businesses are secure while they're off the island and can't access it. So security is a big issue that we have in front of us. And then the last one, and I'll turn it over to Ron, is cleanup. We discovered that and we've had cleanup plans on the books for ages, contracts in place with different contractors. But what we discovered is that there is an inherent conflict between what a community needs to do to qualify for federal money and ensure the safety of our residents and debris removal crews. There's a conflict between that and our residents and our businesses' desire to have access and be back on our properties quickly. What we learned in hindsight, if you think about this, is in order for us to maximize our ability to qualify for FEMA funds, we have to be very, very deliberate and very specific about how we clean up debris. In the case of Hilton Head, as an example, if the information I have is correct, they took several weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, to clean up that island because they were following FEMA's requirements to the letter. And during that period of time, their residents and their businesses had very limited access to those communities. In our case, we recognized that our residents wanted access back on the island immediately if that was at all possible. And our resort wanted access for their tourists on the island probably a little faster than immediate. And it's a real challenge. And as a town, we have an obligation to try to work through those conflicting concerns. Secondly, we were certainly financially, we are not prepared for a $12, $15, $20 million cost for cleanup. So in the case of Kiawah, one of the issues that we clearly have is we need to step back. We're going to be looking at our whole process for cleanup. We need to get back and sit down with the resort, with the developer, with the community association, talk about our respective responsibilities, and we're going to have to deal with this question of how do we balance the desire that I have and all of you have of, okay, I've been away from my house for 5 days. I want to know, is it dry? Is the roof intact? I don't want to sit, in front of the first gate out by Mingo in a line of cars waiting to be allowed into the community. But at the same time, what's that trade-off versus getting hit with a $10, $15, $20 million tab for cleanup? So for Kiawah, those are our issues: communication, security, cleanup, and resources, which Ron will talk about. So with that was way under my 4 minutes, right, Ron?
I'll try to be equally as brief. How much time do I have? Just to elaborate on, my name is Ron Ciancio, and I'm the mayor of Seabrook Island. Just to elaborate on one of the things Craig touched on, and that's Hilton Head. I believe that what Hilton Head did, the town of Hilton Head did immediately, was do a push and shove on the roads in their private gated communities. They did that within the first 72 hours. I don't think they began debris cleanup until they had received approval from FEMA, which my recollection was 2 or 3 weeks after the storm hit. So there was a real tension between their ability to get FEMA reimbursement and, of course, the desire of the residents to return. Their number, the town's number that it spent, was $40 million. And when we had spoken to them, well, about a month or so ago, they had not received a dime back from FEMA. As Craig mentioned, we did learn a number of lessons from Matthew. It provided us with an opportunity to go through our comprehensive plan on a real-time basis. And among the things we learned is where improvements to our plan could and should be made. We learned how very limited our manpower resources are. Our emergency plan has a number of tasks that are to be completed at each change of readiness status, depending upon proximity of the storm to landfall, the so-called OPCON levels. We went from OPCON level 5, normal operations, to OPCON level 1, evacuation, in a very compressed time frame. As a result of that compressed time frame, there were a number of tasks called for by our comprehensive plan that we simply did not have time to complete. So the first lesson we learned is that we do need additional help, people like members of our CERT team, to assist council and staff in discharging the comprehensive emergency plan. We learned a lot more about processes and procedures used by the Sheriff's Department to control traffic both during the course of evacuation and upon return. We had understood, and we kept telling people, that once an evacuation order is issued, that they would only be able to take the mandatory evacuation route to get out of Seabrook. You've undoubtedly heard stories that that wasn't true all of the time. It turns out that the sheriff's officials on the ground have the discretion not to enforce the mandatory evacuation route if traffic flow doesn't dictate it. I would think that for your planning purposes, however, you should continue to assume that that will be required. More importantly, from our perspective, we had been told that checkpoints would be established after the hurricane had passed, which would effectively prevent residents from returning. It turns out that checkpoints will only be established if conditions of the road beyond the checkpoint present risk to vehicular traffic, such as occurred on Main and 17. While that policy does make sense, our assumption factored into the calculus that we used when we were informing residents whether it was going to be safe to return. As I said, we had thought that checkpoints would be established and only learned later that they weren't. As Craig referenced, we learned that the Sheriff's Department will not post a patrol car at our gate. It views its function as law enforcement and not security. We met with them post-event, and they were emphatic that while they will, of course, patrol our community, they will not station a patrol car at the gate, and they will not be a substitute for our own security. So that is something that we have to plan on and react accordingly. We learned that it was very, very difficult for us to get accurate information as to conditions on the ground. I was up in Greenville, extremely frustrating Saturday afternoon trying to find out what happened to Seabrook Island. How bad was the damage? When could we expect to return? Post-event, we sat down with our St. John's Fire Department. They are our first responders. Accordingly, we have established direct lines of communication with the fire chief and her staff, and hopefully, should this happen again, we will have better access to firsthand information and be able to convey that information to our residents and property owners. We learned that we must have better communication between Seabrook Island's principal entities. Accordingly, we have amended our comprehensive plan to provide that post-event, the town will host daily conference calls with our Disaster Recovery Council, which includes members or representatives from both the club and the POA. Hopefully that will be able to be a facility that will allow us to share current information on a real-time basis. We learned that we have to have more effective communication with the Charleston County EOC. Accordingly, we've had all of our council members retrained on Web EOC, an online facility which is to be used by municipalities to convey information and resource requests to the county. We have also taken steps to improve our communication with Charleston County's municipal liaison, the EOC official whose function it is to assist municipalities during an evacuation. Finally, we learned that we have to do a better job of communicating with evacuated residents. We tried to communicate as often as we could during the course of the evacuation using such things as the Tidelines blog and SAPOA e-blast, but we've taken steps to improve that. We now have developed a mechanic where we can email residents directly and provide information on a real-time basis to residents via email. We learned that we have to make more effective use of Code Red in our Twitter account. For those of you who have not signed up to follow the town's Twitter account, I would encourage you to do so, because that's the mechanic that we will use to let you know that we've posted updated information both on our website and on the town's toll-free 800 number. Actually, it's not an 800 number, it's an 888 number. We are examining how better to use social media and particularly Facebook to convey information in the event of an evacuation and an emergency. Finally, we are taking steps to make communication on our website more effective. We can never, we practice and we have drills. We practice twice a year, and we have drills on preparing for a hurricane. The biggest lesson I learned is that we can never be fully prepared. We can be prepared to the fullest extent possible and react accordingly, and I think we are doing that. So with that, with the limited time we have remaining, if anybody has any questions or comments, two things. One, actually probably three things. Firstly, I think it is, the question is it Berkeley Electric's policy to turn off power in the event of a hurricane? Three things. One, I think that you should assume in all instances, if a hurricane hits, that you're going to lose power. That's a fairly safe assumption. Secondly, I have always assumed or been told that one of the steps that we take in preparing for an evacuation is to turn power off at your electrical switch. And so I naturally did that before we left. Thirdly, I think our communication, at least in the case of Seabrook, our communication with Berkeley was very good. We were talking to them up to and including evacuation and during the course of evacuation. They made the decision based on their determination that if they didn't turn the power off and their equipment suffered damage, it would take 4 to 6 weeks to bring it back to normal. So I think the operating decision was the correct one to make. Could it have been made on an earlier basis? Probably. But as a matter of policy, I don't know that they're going to do that one way or another. And I guess the last thing I will mention is this is a topic that one of the panels will discuss in greater detail. Yes.
What are the items that FEMA has that take so long after the hurricane to respond, or is it slow in responding?
I don't know the processes and procedures they go through. I know that we are instructed to work through the state EMD to reach FEMA. And I know that FEMA's policy says that you're not if municipalities want reimbursement, they're not to do any work until they issue their approval. Now, is that a hard and fast rule? It's what they say in writing. So I don't know.
And again, we've spent some time with FEMA trying to understand, what the requirements would have been. I don't have the full answer either, but a part of it is, our process when we went in was to get stuff off of people's, into the streets so we could then come down and just mass pick it up as fast as we could. FEMA requires a lot of control in terms of everything has to be accounted for. Each pile that's taken off has to be weighed, measured. Where did it come from? Where is it going to go? So this ability that we have to just say, we had 5 or 6 contractors in there that just, Kika was moving stuff, we were moving stuff, and it was just get it out. In retrospect, if we were going to, and this is not the only issue, but FEMA would have required us to do things in a very different way. And it's just slower. It's a lot. There's a lot more counting and ensuring that you moved this many tons and that volume and whatever.
One of the things we learned from visiting with Hilton Head is how time demanding, paperwork demanding the FEMA process is. Hilton Head had 8 full-time people working full-time on satisfying FEMA requirements. I mean, we've got a staff of 3. That's not, we're not going to, we couldn't handle it. We couldn't handle it. Yes.
So Mayor, I guess I would question, is it really wise and prudent when you develop or revise or emergency response plans to couch that or plan on having that FEMA reimbursement drive the process? I would think that smart planning what needs to be done first to secure life, property, safety, and those things, regardless of whether you may or may not be reimbursed by the federal government.
I'm glad you said that because that's exactly what our plan is.
And I think in Kiawah's situation, I expect we'll probably end up in the same place. 2 of our council members over the next few months are going to work together with our resort, with our developers, community association. I think we're going to have to get our arms around the idea that we probably will not ever get much in FEMA money. So we've got to be looking at the question of should we be, we don't reserve today at all for these costs. Should we be reserving? Should we be going out and getting credit lines? But probably the discussion's going to turn to, okay, how do we make sure we have the financial resources then to manage it? I suspect that's where we'll end up as well.
John, I know you want to move on, but let me just add one thing. We're having discussions with the POA very similar to what Craig has described. We couldn't handle, I mean, a $40 million hit to Seabrook Island, we couldn't handle it. The town has established a reserve. We've been supplementing that reserve over the past 3 or 4 years. So we have a reserve of funds. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's more than $1.5 million. 3 years ago, we passed a bond ordinance which allows us to issue up to $4 million in bonds or tax anticipation notes. We don't have a firm commitment for the purchase of those bonds, but we discuss on a routine basis with our banking lines their willingness to purchase the bonds in the event of emergency, and at this point I have at least a high confidence that they will. We've sat down with the POA and said, okay, if worst case happens, how do we sit down and allocate funds and share the cost between us? We're trying to do that to the best we can. Appreciate that we're a small community and there's not a lot of money. If we issue bonds, we're going to have to levy a tax to pay for them. People are not going to like that. There's a lag between the time you assess a tax and the time you collect the money. All that makes it more difficult. It's a complicated situation.